thank you everyone for coming, and it's really nice to have been invited. I'm a distant fan of AMASE from down here in the south. So in this talk, we'll have a little kind of deep dive into the double empathy problem, a cognitive linguistic theory called relevance theory, and see how they might relate. And then I'll share a little bit about my research project that I did for my PhD, looking at communication between autistic and non-autistic speakers. So just to start from the very beginning, language and communication problems have had a central role in descriptions of autism from the very beginning. Traditionally, the medical model has viewed autism as a neurodevelopmental disorder. And from that view, autistic communication and language use has traditionally been described as pragmatically impaired. And here, pragmatics relates to the social use of language, and we'll look at that a bit more shortly. And in the diagnostic and statistical manual that people use to give a diagnosis of autism, communication is described as there being a failure of normal back and forth conversation and poorly integrated verbal and non-verbal interactions. But as we know, thankfully, there's also the neurodiversity paradigm. And in this perspective, autism is viewed as a form of neurodivergence, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but for those of you who aren't, you could think about it as a specific neurological state or a particular disposition, and one that's different but not less. So from the traditional perspective, difficulties with communication have been ascribed to impaired theory of mind. And theory of mind is the ability to perceive and understand the mental states of others. But from within more of the neurodiversity paradigm, communication problems are described from a theory called the double empathy problem. I think a lot of you will be familiar with. But for those of you who aren't, just to recap, the double empathy problem describes cross-neurotype communication between speakers of different neurotypes. I'll use that expression a lot in this talk, and here I mean between autistic and non-autistic speakers. Is troubled by a disjuncture in reciprocity between two differently disposed social actors who hold different norms and expectations of each other. So from this perspective, difficulties in communication are attributed to the double empathy problem rather than inherent impairments or inherent difficulties with theory of mind. And it's seen as, misunderstandings are seen as a mutual failure in reaching consensus and understanding. We've got a lot of empirical evidence for the double empathy problem now that's come out in the last few years. We know that non-autistic people also have difficulty in inferring autistic affective and mental states, and affective relates to feelings and emotions. Non-autistic people tend to form negative first impressions about autistic people, which affects how interactions occur. And autistic people experience high levels of mutual understanding when interacting with other autistic individuals. So that's the kind of background and where I was coming from when I started my PhD. And when I began my PhD, I got really fascinated with a linguistic theory called relevance theory. And this tries to offer a cognitive explanation for how we as humans understand each other in a really complex world. And I had a kind of intuition that this might pair really well with the double empathy problem, and that's what I looked at in my research. So a bit of an overview about relevance theory. It tries to answer the problem of how do I know what you mean when you could mean lots of different things with the words that you say. So for example, the person here is saying it's getting a bit chilly. Now this might mean I'm cold. It could also mean, could I borrow a jumper, please? It could also mean, would you mind shutting the window? Or is it okay if I shut the window? It could also mean, it's probably time to head back home. It's only going to get colder on the walk. It could also mean, it would be really great if you could put your arm around me, like in rom-coms. And it could also mean, I knew it was going to get cold, but you refused to believe me. I can't believe you persuaded me not to bring a coat. I'm going to be freezing now, and it's all your fault. And really, there's an infinite, or a close to infinite, number of ways that you can interpret anything that people say. So these different potential interpretations are called inferences. So this is a big problem when we try to think about how language works, because words don't equal meaning. Lots of people have tried to think about this. There's a whole field of linguistics called pragmatics, which looks at the role of social context in utterance interpretation, or how we understand what people have said. And relevance theory is one theory that's tried to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what's going on and how we do that, how we can work out which of these is the correct interpretation when you've just got a few words to go by. So relevance theory is underpinned by two principles. And it's quite a complex theory, and we've only got quite a short time, so it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but don't worry about the detail. If it gets a bit confusing, we'll recap at the end. And this is really just a sort of overview. So the first principle of relevance theory is the cognitive principle of relevance. And this says that in a world full of information and with limited processing power, because we've all got limited ability to process with our brains, all human cognition has evolved to be geared towards a search for relevance. So basically picking out the most useful information in any given moment. And this is a claim that's backed up by cognitive science as well. So this is, we can take this as fairly reliable. So you might be wondering, how do we calculate what's relevant? How do we make that decision? And relevance theory says that we have an heuristic, or a shorthand kind of quick formula that calculates the balance between the effort required to process something and the potential value it brings to us, which is measured in cognitive effects. And in this case, cognitive effects include anything like the introduction of new facts, or new beliefs, or new information, or it could be strengthening or contradicting existing beliefs or assumptions. Or it could be where this new piece of information mixes with something you already know, and you can create a new idea or a new concept. So it's anything that kind of creates changes in your brain, or your cognitive, in your mind. So because human cognition is geared toward the search for relevance, we have the second principle in relevance theory, which is the communicative principle of relevance. And because human cognition is focused on seeking out relevance, relevance theory suggests that we implicitly know this, and we pick this up from infancy. And so as we develop as speakers, we ensure that our utterances, and utterances is just the technical word for things that you say or write, are shaped to make the most of it. So to get people's attention, to get your listeners' attention, to give them something that's relevant, and we craft our utterances, or what we say, to be most relevant to our addressee. And this means that hearers can trust what's being said to them, that it's relevant enough to be worth the processing effort required to understand it. So speakers are shaping what they say and how they say it intuitively according to the principles of relevance, to the best of their abilities. And of course, we all have different abilities that vary from moment to moment, and on the best knowledge they have available of their intended addressee and the context, so the person they're speaking to. So here, again, it's getting a bit chilly. This person might be thinking, okay, I can see the window is open. I can see that my pal who's sitting next to the window can also see that it's open. And she's seen that I'm looking at the window, and I know she was worried about me catching a cold. So hopefully she'll understand from this, can you please shut the window? Okay, so another really important thing that's central to relevance theory is the idea of cognitive environments. And this is all a bit theoretical, but we'll move toward my study in a little bit. So cognitive environments, every individual is understood to have their own cognitive environment, and this includes all facts and assumptions and beliefs that are potentially available to an individual in any given moment. So, you know, in like right now, I'm thinking about this presentation. I'm hoping you're following it. I'm thinking about my cup of tea I've just had. There are and how delicious it is. Biscuit flavour, Yorkshire tea. There are loads of things kind of at the fore of my mind. But that's not the entirety of my cognitive environment. There are also all the things that I've got the potential to understand or the potential to assume about the world that's just sitting there available and it's within reach. And that's what we call the cognitive environment. And this is really the outcome of your the worldly environment that you're in, your life experiences, your physical environment, your education, your culture, and your individual cognitive abilities. Everything that's brought you to where you are now shaped your cognitive environment. So everyone's is completely unique, but probably have a lot of things in common if we've grown up in similar environments. Within relevance theory, there's a technical term for the stuff in your cognitive environment that's really accessible and in reach in a given moment, and that's manifest. So these facts and assumptions you can grab hold of, manifest. And this is important because when we start to think about two cognitive environments interacting, which is what's happening in communication. So when portions of two different individuals' cognitive environments overlap, and this might be because they're in the same physical environment and they can see the same things, or it might be that they've got shared autobiographical knowledge and they know things from each other's life stories, or just that they share the same culture. These shared facts and assumptions become a mutual cognitive environment. You both know or can potentially know the same things at the same time. When it's obvious to both speakers that these certain facts and assumptions are shared, for example, if it's raining, we can both see the rain, we can both feel the rain, we can see that the other one can see and feel the rain, we know that we both know that it's raining. These facts and assumptions are said to be mutually manifest. So that's basically the shared common ground that we know about and we assume that we share. And this is important, and it is a bit complicated, but I wanted to include it because it's important because this is the basis on which the judgments relating to relevance of an utterance are formed. So that when you're crafting your utterance as a speaker, you're using the principles of relevance and shaping your utterance to make it the most relevant as possible for your the person that you're talking to. But you're basing that judgment on what you think is mutually manifest and what's shared. So bringing it back round to cross-neurotype communication between autistic and non-autistic people in this case, I think it's really important. We know that autistic people have sensory and perceptual differences in experience in the world to non-autistic people. And this affects not only what you perceive through your senses, but also how you understand things and how you perceive and store knowledge and keep it in your brain. So it's almost like a slightly different reality through the slightly different sensory experiences, and also like a slightly different filing cabinet of how you make sense of things and store it. So I would argue that what's most relevant and most accessible in an autistic person's mind might be quite different to what's relevant and easily accessible in a non-autistic mind at any given moment. So yeah, excuse my clip art. There's a kind of picture, and one person's interpretation, they're seeing mountains, they're thinking of a holiday they've been on, hot air balloons, and all these kind of associations are triggered. But another person might look at it and first notice the shapes or the composition or the structure, and that's sort of to try and give an indication of the different way that sensory differences and how we organise our understanding of the world can lead to different interpretations of things. So when you bring that to communication, I think this is where we start to see some of the gaps that that the double empathy problem describes. So I'm laughing at this diagram, sorry. So everyone has a different set of ideas and assumptions available to them at any given time in their cognitive environments. And we're always guessing what's mutually manifest with another speaker. No one can actually mind read. So I'd argue that the gap between what's in the cognitive environment of an autistic and non-autistic person is potentially greater than the gap between two non-autistic people, or perhaps two autistic people with similar sensory profiles or similar backgrounds. Okay, so I've tried to make an example. So here you've got two individuals, two cognitive environments. This middle area that's a bit purpley is a mutual manifestness area. What we have in common, what we know that we share. However, we can get this wrong sometimes if we don't actually share the common ground that we thought we did. And this is where I think the sensory differences and the organizational differences come in. So the example here is, it's obviously cold weather today. We can both see and feel that. So we both know that it's a fact. It's really obvious. So one person, and this is, this is being assumed that it's it's mutually manifest. So this person says, it's getting a bit chilly. What they're hoping is, I hope that they offer me their jumper. The other person perhaps has a very different sensory experience of the world, is thinking, that's a really weird thing to say, considering it's so super warm. Maybe they're sick. And what they say is, we can pop into the pharmacy if you need some paracetamol. And on the surface, this looks like a really real miscommunication and mismatched, pragmatically mismatched responses. And in my diagram, there's no assumption which person here is autistic or not. It could be either. Okay, so with this all in mind, I think there are a lot of parallels between cross-neurotype communication and cross-cultural communication. So I've just summarized it here. In cross-cultural communication between speakers from two very different cultural backgrounds, you've got reduced mutual cognitive environments. There's less that's shared. I don't know if you can see my hands. There's less crossover, and so what's mutually manifest is smaller. However, the cultural, conceptual, and cognitive differences are known and they're manifest. Usually, in intercultural encounters, often it's quite evident that it is an intercultural encounter, and so that's known and that's part of the mutually manifest environment. And this can be often be overcome through extra efforts made in the form of accommodation. Accommodation is a linguistic term that describes the process of moderating and changing your language to match the norms and the patterns of speakers around you. However, in cross-neurotype communication, there's still potentially a reduced mutual cognitive environment and less is mutually manifest, but the differences are often invisible. There's more room for error in assuming mutual manifestness, like in the terrible diagram on the previous slide. So this is demonstrated really well by Alyssa Hillary, drawing on their experiences of an American autistic bilingual in China. And they say, the double empathy problem was less of a problem for me in China, despite the greater difference in perspectives, because principles of cross-cultural communication were used over the idea that I have a communication disorder, so this is my problem. And what Alyssa writes about is the differences in the quality of communicative experience when the gaps are framed in their home country of the USA as a communication disorder, where the responsibility of repair or breakdown of mutual understanding is on them, or it's just assumed that they aren't capable. And abroad, when it's framed as an intercultural issue and the repair is seen as a shared responsibility that can be navigated together. There's not too much longer. Hope I'm in time. So we know that intercultural communication is actually often highly successful, even when speakers don't have a particularly high level of the language that they have in common. So, for example, I used to teach business English to professionals from different parts of the world, and often they would come and they may not have a very strong vocabulary, and they might not have great mastery of the grammar. They'd be using English as a lingua franca to communicate, and they'd both come from different language backgrounds, but they'd find a way and they would form rapport and understand each other, and it would work really well. So I think that kind of approach can potentially be something of a solution where when addressing the double empathy problem, because you can maybe make the gaps more visible, make the gaps more visible, so make those differences known and make them manifest, and make the extra efforts to overcome them in the same way. So this is what I think Jim Sinclair, an autism rights activist, is getting at in his address to neurotypicals. And he said, it takes more to communicate with someone whose native language isn't the same as yours, and autism goes deeper than language and culture. Autistic people are foreigners in any society. You're going to have to give up your assumptions about shared meanings. You're going to have to learn to back up to levels more basic than you've probably thought about before, to translate and to check to make sure your translation is understood. You're going to have to give up the certainty that comes of being on your own familiar territory, of knowing you're in charge. And I think, you could swap out the idea of familiar territory with, what's mutually manifest, assuming that things are mutually manifest when perhaps they aren't, and making those extra efforts to understand. Okay, so this is just a slide of a frog staring into the distance for a little brain break, because that's probably a lot of information. I've just got a couple more slides about my study. That's okay, there's something in the chat that is it telling me to, oh no, okay. There's the anxiety frog. Okay, so my study. Frog doesn't want to go. That's it. Just got a frog. Frog's taken over. All right, bear with me. Maybe that's it. The frog's completely killed my computer. It's a frog of doom. Okay. Should I share the study, or would it be better to stop and have I'm just thinking about time, saying no.
No, if you can share it, and the frog will leave again, then share away.
Okay. Frog. Absolute trouble frog. Okay. 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 So for my PhD research, I was looking at the double empathy problem and relevance theory, but I also wanted to look at some conversations or some real life examples of communication to analyze and see where there might be breakdowns in communication. So to do that, I invited people to come along for like a pilot community engagement project where participants could come and talk in pairs about loneliness. And the topic in theory was random, like I didn't need it to be a particular topic for the analysis, but it just felt like it was an important theme and something that was relevant to autistic people. So there were 8 core autistic participants, and they each had 3 10-minute conversations each. The first was with a familiar chosen conversation partner, So this was typically like a family member or a friend or a work colleague. The second was an autistic stranger, someone they hadn't met. So this was an unfamiliar person. And the third conversation partner was a non-autistic stranger, so another unfamiliar person. And these conversations were recorded and transcribed and then analysed. And based on the double empathy problem and relevance theory, I predicted that mutual understanding would be hardest to achieve in cross-neurotype pairs, and that familiarity with your interlocutor or the person you're speaking with would improve mutual understanding in cross-dispositional or cross-neurotype communication. But this wasn't really true, which surprised me, because what I actually found was that there was just so much mutual understanding in all of the conversation pairings. All 5 of the matched neurotype conversations between pairs of autistic speakers seem to be characterized by significant and sometimes quite dramatic increase in flow, in rapport and intersubjective attunement. So that was things like you'd get things that would suggest that were like mirroring or you know, echoing phrases or yeah. And for most of these pairings, these were complete strangers to one another. There was only one pair that knew each other because someone had thought their familiar chosen partner was autistic. There was also sometimes more flow, more rapport and mutual understanding in these conversations than when those autistic people spoke with their non-autistic friends or family members that they knew well. And this isn't to say that the relationships or friendships weren't good with the people that they knew and they brought along. It's just that in conversational terms, the conversation was more fluid and bounced back and forth more quickly, and there weren't so many gaps and awkward pauses. In some cases, autistic people who had difficulties with speaking, like stuttering or forgetting words or saying wrong words, had fewer of these problems when they were talking with the other autistic people, most of whom were strangers. But there were also some instances where cross-neurotype pairs, autistic people and non-autistic people, appeared to achieve really high levels of attunement and rapport and mutual understanding. And this isn't what traditional autism theories would expect. And it may be that the topic of loneliness helped to create common ground where people had similar experiences to share, making it easier to connect, and maybe creating a kind of basis for greater mutual manifestness. So all of the findings are in this paper. You can scan the QR code or type it into Google, and there's a lot more detail about the codings and how I came up with those and what we found. There's also, we just released this yesterday, an explainer video that's made accessibly with some autistic artists to summarize that study. Again, QR code online. And I think that's it. Oh, summary. The double empathy problem reframes cross-neurotype breakdowns in communication as a two-way mismatch of norms and expectations. Relevance theory tries to answer the problem, how do we know what people mean? And it suggests that we work it out based on a calculation of relevance, what's most relevant to our speaker. And I've suggested that in cross-neurotype communication, because the mismatch of norms and expectations is often invisible, communication breakdowns can occur more often. That's it. I can share the slides. That's just a summary of the study, but we've just heard that, and there's references.